macroscopic level, they exist to kill. They travel, they attack, they hide, they even gather together in defense maneuvers. Pathogens are the enemies of every member of the healthcare team. On Pathogens and PPE, we give you the tools you need to fight these threats and win. So sit back, tune in, and let's make these microbes tremble at the sound of your name.
Welcome back to the Pathogens and PPE podcast. This is episode 10 about high-level disinfectants and sterilants. I'm here in the studio with Garrett Hollembeak, and I am Jill Holdsworth, Manager of Infection Prevention at Emory University Hospital Midtown in Atlanta, Georgia. Garrett, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Hey, thanks, Jill. Really excited to be here today. Like Jill said, my name is Garrett Hollembeak. I'm the infection preventionist for Bon Secours Mercy Health at their Fairfield Hospital. This is new IP. Before this, I was sterile processing. So this is a pretty exciting episode to see how this business of HLD fits into infection prevention. So I'm pretty excited about today's episode.
Excited to have you in the studio today. And we have two great guests for you, Robby Miller and Jake McHugh. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back. Welcome back, everybody, to the Pathogens and PPE podcast. This episode is all about high-level disinfectants and sterilants. I'm here in the studio with my co-host, Garrett, and we have two awesome guests today, Robby Miller and Jake McHugh. I'm going to ask them just to tell us a little bit about themselves before we get started. Robby, why don't we start with you?
Well, thanks for having me, Jill and Garrett. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Robby. I'm a sterile processing department manager out of Phoenix, Arizona at St. Joseph's Hospital Medical Center. I've been in the industry for a little over 20 years and leading an SPD. So again, pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Great to have you. Jake, your turn.
Hi, I'm Jake McHugh. I'm a process improvement auditor at Agility. I'm here based in the northeastern part of Florida, but I'll travel wherever they send me. I've been in the industry for over 15 years, not as much as you, Robby, but I'm getting there.
Great to have you both. All right, let's go ahead and get started with kind of a softball question here, but a really basic one for this episode. Why don't we start with just kind of understanding the differences between high-level disinfection and sterilization. Robby, why don't you take this one and just give us kind of a high-level overview of the two?
Yeah, there are two basic fundamental differences between these two. High-level disinfection is going to kill all microbial life, but it doesn't necessarily destroy large numbers of bacterial spores, where sterilization is going to kill everything. Sterilization is really going to destroy 100% of all bacteria, fungus, viruses, as well as all spores present. And it's a validated process.
Robby, for our audience and just for me too, when you're talking about a spore, where do we see those? Why is that important?
So spores are tiny little microscopic organisms that when subjected to the right conditions can actually wake up essentially and create life. They can survive for extremely long periods of times in very harsh conditions. And so obviously when we are entering the sterile part of the body, the bloodstream, for example, and making an incision, it's important that we do destroy those spores in order to create a sterile environment to minimize the risk of infection. Whereas with high-level disinfection, we're working within a mucous membrane typically. And so much like, if we think about oral as a mucous membrane, we swallow things all the time and it's a very little risk to us, correct?
Thanks for explaining that. I think that gets overlooked a lot of the times about what really is the difference between HLD and sterilization. So thanks for explaining that.
That was great. Thanks so much, Robby. And Jake, can you give us a rundown, especially as an IP? I seem to have found over my career kind of these random pockets of HLD happening all over my facility, and that's really alarming to me. So for the IPs that are listening out there, where are the different locations in the hospital where you might find HLD versus sterilization, just so that we can kind of be aware of those areas that we may need to be sure that we uncover?
Well, HLD can be happening in a variety of little hidey holes throughout the hospital. As much as we want to try and consolidate it to a central location, there are areas that still get away with it if they can. GI departments are probably the largest one that you think of. Sterile processing departments, even though a lot of what they do is more geared towards sterilization, they may also do high-level disinfection processes. Clinics are probably the one place that kind of hide away. That could be a GYN clinic that takes care of their own items. There's a unique one that I had come across in some of my travels where they were actually high-level disinfecting ultrasound probes. It was a radiation ultrasound department that I had never heard of before. And lo and behold, they were doing these probes.
I want to add to that, Jake, one that I ran across in my career that is kind of an interesting one was fire departments and rescue squads. You don't think about what some of these areas are doing with their laryngoscopes and how are they cleaning them. And it's kind of one of those mysteries you never really knew about, I guess, that you wanted to know. But now that I'm saying it, you're probably thinking, I wonder how they are high-level disinfecting their probes. So that's one of those kind of hidey holes of the world, I guess, from using your own words. But it's a group that I've worked with a lot in my career as an EMT as well. And just making sure that if you're not using disposable equipment or you have to do something that's high-level disinfectant, what are you using? Are you using it correctly? So if anybody's listening out there that's from fire or EMS, that's something that's really important that it's done correctly. And usually you don't have an IP lurking around, making sure that those IFUs are followed. So making sure that you have your infection control officers following up on those kinds of things.
That's a great point. And I know some of them might even use sterile sheaths thinking that that's enough when it really still has to be high-level disinfected or even sterilized before it's used. And one area that I didn't even think of when I was talking about it is some CT clinics will do their own TEE probes. And I've seen a lot of places where those can not only be done slightly off the written documentation, but also not in the greatest of environments where they have these little reprocessing areas set up.
I think both of you raised some great points there to be mindful of, especially in those intubation products. Another very, very common area is anywhere that we're doing women's care. Vaginal speculums, vaginal probing, that kind of thing, to really be mindful that we are watching out for those particular areas and making sure they're being compliant with their processes. And then speech pathology, they often do what we call FEES scoping, where there's flexible scopes, nasal rhinolaryngoscopes, and FEES scopes that are being used that would require high-level disinfection between each patient.
Man, so it sounds like we've got in one healthcare facility or even in a row of clinics, you've got any number of places that things might get stored, they might get stashed, and we don't exactly know if they're being reprocessed correctly. So how do we fix that, essentially? Jake, you mentioned consolidation. Robby, you mentioned kind of the overview of knowing all the areas that you're supposed to be in.
Yeah. I mean, one great thing that we did is that we would take tours throughout the hospital, checking down and finding out each area that was responsible for either a sterilization or high-level disinfection process, and then making sure that they had the right tools, the right processes, the right environment, and coming back around every so often to make sure everything was up to par.
You know, I think that's truly a great practice, Jake. One thing that I see a lot is the OR gets a lot of attention. And I'm sure that you both could agree, as working in sterile processing, you're right there, you're right by the OR. So it's easier to give the OR a lot more attention, a lot more education. But when you have other procedural areas, they sometimes feel left out with the education on pre-cleaning and transport, but you also have items that go to your ICUs that come from sterile processing, and you have things that come from the ED, and those areas need education from sterile processing too, but they're not usually the priority from sterile processing, and we need to make sure that there's some sort of intervention, maybe IP and SPD together, doing rounds like you mentioned, Jake, so that those areas also feel included and also get the same education on pre-cleaning, transport, all of those things. And sometimes that's really hard to do with how much time one has in the day.
Absolutely. And, that just made me kind of think that talking about high-level disinfection, a lot of the mindset goes to where that process is being performed, but even areas that aren't performing high-level disinfection, but the areas that are using those devices, they need to know how to safely handle them and not automatically contaminate them when they get them back, shoving them on a shelf, taking it out of their plastic pouches and shoving it into a drawer.
Yeah, so, I think in my experience, one of the strategies that I've really deployed with this is, and Jill, you hit it, nail on the head. The sterile processing folks, this is their area of expertise, need to partner with infection prevention. And then you need to pull in other stakeholders like your educators. We really, in finding how critical the HLD process is and all the regulatory compliance that's associated with it in order to keep our patients safe and the challenges that we have, the best strategy we've had is to centralize it and to actually bring it into the reprocessing unit, if at all possible, on your campus. We're experts in reprocessing. We're not experts in patient care. And having nurses or patient care staff actually performing reprocessing, it's just not their area of expertise. Not that they can't be trained. They're very intelligent people, but let's let them focus on what they do best and let us focus on what we do best. But it is a multidisciplinary team, including IP and SPD and our educators, to work with all of those parties impacted on all of the things that, Jake, you're mentioning, the cross-contamination, as well as the overall reprocessing and making sure that we're doing it properly.
So, Robby, that makes me think of during one of our Joint Commission prep walkthroughs, we were in ultrasound and asked the technician working there, how are you trained on cleaning this ultrasound probe? And she said, well, I'm agency. This is my first day here. And this is the person that's responsible for cleaning this, reprocessing it, so to speak, and using it on the next patient, which to hear that just kind of gives you a little bit of heartburn.
Absolutely. Competency is a fundamental part of this entire thing, right? And so, again, I just feel that if we can have folks who are committed to doing the reprocessing, certified and doing reprocessing, focusing on that practice, we can achieve better success and compliance. But certainly every facility is challenged with its own, design, workflow, resources available. But it does start with, one, our infection preventionists understanding where these practices are taking place and partnering with the right people in order to ensure that they're being done properly in those facilities.
I love what you just said, Robby, because one of the things that I always recommend to people when I do talks is to have a list of every single item that you perform high-level disinfection on, and always have it at the ready, because surveyors will come in and ask for that same type of list. And if you don't already have that made, you're going to feel extremely overwhelmed on that day when the surveyor asks you for it. And as an IP, I should already know that. I want to know that because I can also use that as an audit tool so that I can go anywhere at any given time and say, I'm going to audit my TEE probes today. I'm going to audit the ureteroscopes today, because they may all be in completely different areas being reprocessed, or they all could be in one area. But what you do want to know is what all is being high level disinfected in your facility, or at least under your umbrella, so that you can go find them and check on them. And then especially if something new comes along, then you want to be able to add it to your list. And that's super helpful when it comes to survey preparedness and when the surveyor walks in. And speaking along the lines of high-level disinfectants, as an IP, I have always tried to get rid of anything that is using something along the lines of Sidex or manual types of soaking. So I want to talk about that a little bit and get your all's opinion on that. What are the big challenges? Why do we always say like, oh, let's move to something automated? What is the big deal with manual soaking, and why is it just easier to move to something automated? Jake, I'll start with you.
Well, an automated process is usually a better situation because of the automation takes that human element out for making mistakes. You know, putting in, we'll say, flexible scopes with all of their channels. There are so many steps for not only manually cleaning it, but now you're going to go through the disinfection process. You have to make sure that your syringes are working, that everything is clean, that you're flushing it through, you're allowing for the soak time, the contact soak time to happen, and that there are no bubbles throughout the process. And then you have to rinse all that through again. It can be very demanding on the technician performing that. So moving to an automated process where the machine does it all for you, probably in a quicker time frame, a lot safer, so your technician can actually go focus on something else.
I can just hear everybody right now wondering if there's bubbles in their scopes.
I'd certainly agree with what you're saying, Jake. You know, automation provides standardization. When we're doing things manually, if you've got 30 technicians, they're probably doing it 30 different ways, right? When you talk about the lumens and flushing, how many mLs are they flushing, right? And with the complex IFUs that we're dealing with, it really creates that standardization that we're looking for, taking out that human element. That's a huge advantage. I think, Jill, to your comments about eliminating Sidex OPA, I mean, one always comes down to the instructions for use and what manufacturers are stating is required to disinfect their product. And unfortunately, we do see differences from one company to another, one device to another, which can put facilities and departments in predicaments where they have to use multiple high-level disinfectants, and then we need to be aware of what those risks are. As with Sidex OPA, there are a few risks when using Sidex OPA, known risks when it comes to cystoscopies, for example, or HPV when dealing with HPV.
Can you go into that a little bit more, Robby? I think that's new information to me, and I think maybe new information to some of our listeners about some of those risks.
Yeah, so, you know, Sidex OPA has known risks with patients who've received multiple cystoscopies, for example, treated for bladder cancers, have been known to have anaphylactic reactions when exposed to Sidex OPA, which is why it's really critical that you're following protocols for rinsing Sidex OPA or any other orthophthalaldehyde off of the device before it's reintroduced to another patient and that risk of exposure to it, as well as HPV, the strands HPV 16 and 18 specifically have shown great resistance to numerous high-level disinfectants, including Sidex OPA. And in fact, right now, vaporized hydrogen peroxide is really the only product that's known to destroy HPV 16 and 18 specifically. And so certainly with devices that are being used in the vaginal canal or rectally, that's something you might want to take into consideration in making sure that we're using the proper high-level disinfectant in order to ensure your patient's safety.
Wow, that's great information. And I think you're right, Garrett. I think that may be new information for some of our listeners. We probably should go into that a little bit more on another episode. There'll probably be a whole episode just on that. Switching gears a little bit, how do you know in regards to your equipment if the solution that you're using is actually even indicated to be used on that piece of equipment? And Robby, why don't you start with this one?
Yeah, I think, you know, that IFU, right? We think IFU is a four-letter word, but it comes back to we've got to check our IFUs, right? And again, as I alluded to before, the reality is oftentimes we're put in situations where a device may be only validated for one high-level disinfectant. You may have multiple devices. We kind of talked about, the TE probes. We've got vaginal probes. We've got flexible scopes. Maybe you have an esophageal disease center. You're doing motility catheters. And then even think about your topical probes that are being used on non-intact skin. All these different devices might require a specific high-level disinfectant. So it comes back to the IFU, and then you can start to figure out how you're going to deploy that high-level disinfectant. Hopefully you have an automated method. And I think it's important to also recognize that the new ST91 standard that was published in 2021 really recommends that for flexible scopes specifically, we are using automated methods, not manual methods. That is now the recommendation. And so all of our facilities should be moving towards that once you determine what high-level disinfectant you are in fact going to use. And then the last piece is some flexible scopes require sterilization. And so it's important to really understand that as well.
I think more and more we're finding that the one-size-fits-all approach is not sufficient for these complex instruments.
We use four different high-level disinfectants in my facility, and if I could, streamline that down, my goodness, it would be huge. But again, that's part of the centralization piece and part of the challenge based on IFUs. But that's kind of the reality with the complex environment we're working in with so many different devices and technologies available to us now.
Jake, I'm going to ask you the golden question, and I hope you have the answer to it because it'll make everybody listening really happy. What's the cheat sheet, the Cliff Notes, if anybody's as old as me and remembers Cliff Notes, to finding the easiest way to understand the IFUs and to know what is the best way to clean these scopes or these instruments, or do I use high-level disinfection? Do I sterilize? I think that's the biggest struggle everyone has these days. And I think that most people just kind of follow what everybody else is doing in the department. And if they see somebody else doing it this way, they're just going to do it too. They maybe won't verify if the IFU is what they're supposed to be doing.
I mean, I wish I had a golden answer, but it really is about due diligence. You have to go through each individual device. You have to read those IFUs. And, speaking back to Robby's point, I remember finding a rigid scope that was being high-level disinfected, and we went through the IFUs, and the ones that had several there listed to use, that had several there listed to not use, and the one being used didn't kind of fall into any of those categories. So what did we do? Well, we called the manufacturer and we talked with them, and it turns out that it actually was approved. They had additional information for that, and we got that and put it into our records. But it can be very confusing. But, to be safe across all boards, if something can be sterilized, I would try to move that device away from high-level disinfection and move it into sterilization if possible. I know that can be challenging, but it is going to be safer for the patient in the long run and probably an easier process than, say, a manual high-level disinfection or even sometimes an automated high-level disinfection process. And saying that, I also want to mention that whenever you are moving from high-level disinfection to a sterilization, there is a chance that some of these devices can start to break down because it's so used to that high-level process, which is low impacting. The sterilization is such an aggressive force. I have seen instruments that tend to start to break down and have to go out for repair.
I never would have thought of that when you switch. That's a really great point.
I'm not going to say that it happens every time, but it's almost like the instruments get used to the chemical. And it's like, wait, what are you doing to me now? This isn't where I belong.
It's a rigorous process. I mean, if it's tough on bacteria, it's going to be tough on the instrument, the material too.
Absolutely.
You hit on instrument safety, what's safe for the instrument. We've hit on what's safe for the patient. I'm wondering staff safety. Some of these chemicals are pretty caustic. They have different PPE requirements. How do you balance and fit all that into finding not just what fits the IFU, what fits your policies, but what's safest for our staff to use?
Yeah, I'll take that one. It's a great question, Garrett. I think staff safety is, one of the most critical factors that we need to take into consideration when we are reprocessing medical devices. It's not just about the patient. It's also about the staff who are handling these devices that have been exposed to patients in bodily fluids and bloodborne pathogens potentially. As we know, not every patient is healthy, right? So PPE is extremely important, and it starts with teaching staff how to wear PPE, how to don and doff their PPE appropriately. I always tell staff, PPE in practice will keep you safe when you're working in this environment. If you wear it properly, and you're cautious about what you're doing, where you're putting your hands, that kind of thing, you're going to keep yourself safe. But then we are working with chemicals that are designed to destroy life, right? That's what high-level disinfectants and sterilants do. They destroy microorganisms. So it is about ensuring staff safety through potentially monitoring the air when we're working with chemistries, whether they're high-level disinfectants or low-temperature sterilants like ethylene oxide or vaporized hydrogen peroxide, which many of us are using in our facility in some capacity. And we can do that with badge monitoring. We can do it with area monitors, that type of thing. But having a plan in place to actually do area monitoring with those chemicals, I think is important to, let your staff know that you care about them and make sure that you are, in fact, keeping them safe.
I love that. And we should also have a plan in case things don't go safe. What happens when that chemical spills or somebody gets splashed, and having a process in place for taking care of, the negative aspects when it does go, to the level 10.
Robby, I have a follow-up question for you based on what we were talking about just a minute ago. As a leader in the department, how have you been able to work it in for staff to allow them the time to look up IFUs, or encouraging them to look up IFUs so that it's just part of their normal workflow?
Yeah, so I am blessed to have a strong leadership team. And so the way we've really designed it is that the leaders are responsible for monitoring every new incoming device, looking up the IFU. We store the IFU electronically in a shared drive that the staff have access to. We educate them to that drive so they are able to look anything up if they have clarifying questions about an IFU. But ultimately, we have a communication process as we implement every device to communicate to the staff how to process that with respect to, is it high-level disinfected? Is it sterilized? Can it go in a washer? Can it not? Can it go in an ultrasonic? Can it not? Can it be immersed? Can it not? Do you hand wash? Do you automated wash? And we do that through multiple forms, starting with huddle, posting, emails, and then ultimately the IFU stored in a shared drive for them. But we take the responsibility of communicating that to them and providing that resource that they can always look it up themselves.
Autonomy is so huge.
That's really fantastic.
I would add to that your infection preventionist should have access to that information so that they can come in. I think it's really important that our IPs can come in and back us up as leaders, know what they're looking for within the department to make sure that we're doing a good job. We're a team in this. So for them to have access to it as well is very, very important, especially as you're strategizing where and how you're going to process the various devices that are being used on any given campus.
Yeah, absolutely. And as an IP, I will give a cheerleading moment for if you don't spend a lot of time in SPD, this is your chance. This is your moment to go and spend time down there. If it's your first time there, that's okay. Just walk in there and tell them you want to observe, you want to learn. That's how we all learn. Nobody expects every IP to walk in as an expert in sterile processing like Garrett. It is. He's an IP now, but he was from sterile processing. But most of us had no idea what sterile processing was. So you must spend time there if you really want to understand SPD. And that is also a great way to earn some respect, make some friends, form relationships in sterile processing. So I can't say that enough, to spend time there and not make that time auditing time. Just make it time that you're learning and observing. And guys, this went so fast, but we are actually over our time for this podcast. I had so many other things that I wanted to ask and talk about. This has been so great. I think we could talk about this topic for hours. Thank you all so much for being on here. Robby, Jake, this was so great. There's so many other things I'd like to follow up on, but we are out of time for today. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Great job, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now we got to have part 2.
Well, that was a great episode. The number of topics we covered, and I think you could probably roll this into a second episode. Some of this we just scratched the surface on. Talking about, 1, what is HLD? We hear the acronym all the time. 2, how to centralize and standardize, why that matters to the patient. And then understanding how to stay compliant to that instruction for use. What comes in your door? Can you disinfect it? Can you sterilize it? So, and we really hit on a broad group of topics, but every piece of it is something they can take back to their hospital today.
I was really intrigued by the conversation about reviewing items that you already are doing HLD on and switching them to sterilization if possible. I really hadn't thought about actively going through that process and being very intentional about that. And even thinking about they may break down if you do that, even if it's the best thing to do, that they were used to the chemicals. So I thought that was really interesting. And I haven't really heard of anybody being very intentional about going through everything that they have and checking to see if sterilization was an option and they should switch to that. So I thought that was really intriguing, and thinking about how we might even start that process at my facility. So I think that will be really interesting to see who starts doing that after this discussion, and I'd love to hear some feedback on that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And remember, wash your hands.
And keep fighting dirty.
Thanks for tuning in to this exclusive podcast series on pathogens and PPE. For more information and clinical resources to help you fight dirty, make sure to follow us on social media by searching for Beyond Clean and Transmission Control.